So we're concluding our series on the book of Proverbs today. We've been going through Proverbs for the last few weeks, and so we're going to transition in the next couple weeks and over the summer into something different, and then as we transition into meeting face-to-face again when we do that in late July and into early August. And so Proverbs, as I've told you over the last few weeks, is a wisdom book. And it's a wisdom book along with the book of Ecclesiastes, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and also the book of Job. And the reason these are all three considered wisdom books is because they all approach the questions of life from different angles or different perspectives. They all answer or try to answer or attempt to answer the deepest and hardest questions of life. Maybe about meaning, like what's my purpose here on earth? Or maybe you think about evil and suffering and justice, and so we wrestle with those types of questions. But Proverbs specifically begins to talk about wisdom, which is one of the main topics it talks about throughout the book, and then also the opposite of that, which is to live life foolishly. Now, the goal of King Solomon, who wrote this book, and also the book of Ecclesiastes, his goal was to help us, or is to help us, navigate life well. So he's talking to us from a person who has a lot of experience, a person who has lived life, has even learned from his mistakes, and is trying to tell us, you don't want to make these same mistakes as I did, because if you do, here are the consequences you're going to have. But on the flip side, he also talks to us about the benefits of embracing wisdom, and specifically God's wisdom. So it's not our wisdom, human wisdom, but it's embracing God's wisdom that we're then able to navigate this life well. And so, as we always do with our studies together, our conversations together, I always start out with a question. And our question for today is this: what is wisdom? What is wisdom? Now, I imagine that all of us probably know generally what wisdom is. We all have there's a definition for it. And wisdom is the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment, or like every other dictionary says, it's like the quality of being wise. They don't quite define it, but they always seem to throw that part in there, the quality of being wise. Now, I think we would all agree, generally speaking, on what it means to be wise. We see this definition there, and we all agree with it, that's really what it means to have wisdom in our world today. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to think about somebody in your life that you consider wise. Now, what is it about them that makes them wise? Why would you call them wise in the first place? Now, there are probably different characteristics of this person that you think about. Besides that you trust them, but there's probably other qualities maybe that you have, that they have, that makes you call them wise. Or maybe other people refer to them as wise or as a person having wisdom. We often think that someone who is wise is old. We often equate old age with wisdom. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think more likely, or generally speaking, people who are older are people who have lived life. These are people who have a whole lot of life experience. These are people who have made mistakes. These are people who have learned from their mistakes. But that's not always the case. I know people who are older who still haven't learned from their mistakes and are still making the same mistakes over and over again. So I wouldn't necessarily say in those instances that those people would be considered wise. But generally speaking, someone who is older, someone with gray hair, seems to be a person who is wise. And now even science, at least the study that I looked at, talked about how older people should be considered wise. Because oftentimes they found that in the study that they did, that older people seem to be less compulsive in their spending. So you might have a young person who has a lot of money or some money that they get, and they go to the store, they spend it, generally maybe. But then an older person may be less compulsive. They're not going to spend the money on that thing. And so the study sort of proved the point, at least for the group that they had, is that older people tend to be wise. We also think that people who are successful are wise as well. They obviously have to know a whole lot about something in order to get to the place that they are. Whether they are the CEO of some big company, or they're some business owner, or they are some high up academic, or some high up doctor. We look at these people and know that they are very successful in their life and have to maybe assume that they are wise, right? That they don't just know a whole lot about their specific field. They don't just know a whole lot about their business or how to lead, but they have a know-how, right? They know what to do with what it is that they know. So we look at these successful people as people who are wise. And we also think of intelligence as a sign of wisdom as well. In my particular field, we have people who will go study at different universities that have a certain professor there because they look at that professor as knowing a whole lot about their field. They're very successful, very intelligent. They have the know-how in their particular area of study. And so students will travel from all over the world, either to come to the United States or go from the United States somewhere else to study under a specific professor because they think they know a whole lot, and perhaps they do know a whole lot, and so they may be considered wise to these people. So maybe it's not just professors, it's your coworkers, or it's your boss, or maybe it's family or friends, whoever else it might be. These people might just be highly intelligent, and so you go to them to find the answers for some of the toughest questions that you may have about your work, or maybe even about life. So we consider these people wise. Now, no matter how we look at wisdom, who is wise, or what we think about what wisdom is, there's still a question I think we have to be able to answer. And that is, however high we look at, or how highly we look at wisdom, how far does wisdom actually get us in life? Does wisdom actually have any limitations when we think about it, whether in our field of study, whether we think about it when we're talking to somebody who's older, or maybe even someone who's successful? Right? Is there a limit to wisdom in our world today? There's a famous artist named Renoir. And so you can find his paintings on, you can look it up on Google or something, and you can probably find it in many of the top art institutes of our world. But Renoir was a very good artist. He was good at what he did. Right? He didn't just know a whole lot about art, but he had a lot of know-how about art as well. Now, he was an artist in the late 1800s, early 1900s in France. And I came across an interesting thing that he had said closer to the end of his life. And here's what he says. He says, "I'm beginning to get to know how to paint. It has taken me 50 years of work to get this far, and there is still more to do." And focus on the last part, and there's still more to do. So even for somebody like this painter, like Renoir, who is known throughout the world by his paintings, and yet he gets to the end of his life and says, yeah, I've painted all of these years, 50 years in fact, but yet I'm still beginning to know how to do this. There's still actually way more to do. There's still way more to know. So having all this knowledge, or having even all this wisdom or this know-how, right, only gets us so far. It only got Renoir so far. It felt like there was still more to learn. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, we're honest about life, we know that we are limited human beings. We only live for so long and only attain so much in life. And most importantly, we only gain so much wisdom in life. Right? You may gain some knowledge by going to school for a lot of the years of your life. You may gain a lot of wisdom by talking to a lot of successful, intelligent, or wise people, older people in your life. So you might gain a lot of wisdom from that. But the fact is, the reality is that wisdom and knowledge only get us so far in life. Wisdom and knowledge, our own wisdom and knowledge, has its limitations. Right? It can't answer the deepest questions about life. Let's take it from Solomon, who says in the book of Ecclesiastes, and again, we talk about Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and sometimes those go hand in hand because King Solomon wrote both of these books. And so we take it from King Solomon, who tells us this. He tells us in Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verses 13 through 14, he says, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, chasing after the wind. So Solomon is trying to argue in Ecclesiastes. So if you've read Ecclesiastes, you might get this. If you haven't read it, it might be new to you, and so I'd suggest you go back and maybe take a look at it. But what Solomon is trying to argue throughout the Ecclesiastes and with this verse is that everything we seek after on this earth has its place, and even wisdom. Right? Wisdom is not going to be able to make us content. It's not going to make us satisfied because we're always not going to be able to answer the deepest questions about life. And so he argues that the only way we can get even closer to answering those questions is by embracing the wisdom of God, to have God at the center of our lives. Not wisdom, our own wisdom, or having knowledge in there, or pleasure, or money, or power, or position. Right? None of those things are going to satisfy us. And even our own wisdom and the attempts that we make to try to gain all the answers of all the deepest questions that we have, it still has its limitations. But it's only with God that we're actually able to perhaps even be content with the fact that we don't have an answer for those deepest questions about life. And so what does Solomon say? He says in Ecclesiastes, he talks about wisdom, but he even talks about wisdom in the book of Proverbs. And again, it's a wisdom book. And so we go to the book of Proverbs, the very first chapter. So we're kind of going back to what we talked about at the very beginning of our series together, which is the main sort of topic of this whole book. It's about wisdom. And so we go to Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, and here's what Solomon tells us. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. But then we also read in Ecclesiastes, so this is sort of like a paired verse here. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. It says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom, and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Now we know that Solomon, he knew a lot about wisdom. Again, he wrote both of these books, and I would say that he's a very wise person. But we know that he really embraced wisdom. You go back in his story to 1 Kings chapter 3, and in that particular chapter, he is having a conversation with God. And in that conversation with God, God looks to him and says, Solomon, you can ask of me anything, and I will give it to you. Now imagine for a second yourself in that conversation with God. Would we ask for wisdom? I think, based on our culture today, if a lot of people were in conversation with God, they may ask for some stuff. They may ask for money. Maybe they'll ask for some kind of power, position. Maybe they ask for a loved one, or to be in a relationship. They might ask for all of these things. I'm not saying those are right or wrong, but we look at Solomon, and he seems to be humble in his asking of God, and he says, God, I want wisdom. And so God grants him that request and gives him wisdom. And so he becomes the wisest man in all of Israel, and perhaps even all of the world at that time. And we know he was a very wise person because we're told of another story when a lady by the name of Queen of Sheba, so either she comes from the Middle East or Africa. I think there's some dispute on where she comes from. But the story says that she traveled all the way from her home to meet with Solomon, to have her questions answered. And in the conversation that they have, she determines that he answers those questions very sufficiently. And so she gives him some gold, she gives him some gifts, because he has answered all of her questions. And so he was a very wise person in his time. Now we go back to these passages of Scripture that we've read, and in them we find kind of maybe two opposite takes that Solomon has here. In the very first section that we read in Proverbs chapter 1, we realize that there is a lot of value to wisdom, to embracing God's wisdom, to use that to navigate our life better. God's wisdom is useful for instruction, right? There's a lot of usefulness to it for our lives. But it seems that when you get to Ecclesiastes, that Solomon maybe has a different perspective on wisdom for his life. But I think specifically, though, for Ecclesiastes, I think he might be talking about a different kind of wisdom. I think he may be talking about human wisdom, the best thinking that we can do as humans on our own. When, like in Proverbs, and then when you get closer to the end of Ecclesiastes, that he wants us to embrace God's kind of wisdom. He wants us to embrace God as the center of everything that we do. But you read Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and verses 12 through 18, and you can't help but notice that there's sort of a different take on wisdom. He says that it's meaningless, that it's a chasing after the wind, right? Or even all these pursuits that we have in life are a chasing after the wind. And this, he's saying that they're also meaningless. Now, that doesn't mean exactly as we might think it might mean, or what we think it means, because you get to the end of the book and Solomon concludes that all this stuff actually isn't meaningless, that it actually matters a whole lot. The fact is that putting those as our sole focus, as our main priority in life, that's what's meaningless. That pursuit is meaningless. So instead, when it comes to wisdom, we're to place God at the center. And I think, when you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, it seems, again, kind of the opposite of what we saw in Proverbs. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You go back again to Solomon's story, and you find that he was a very wise man, but yet he was also very foolish at the same time. You go back to 1 Kings, I believe it's chapter 1 through 11. And in those chapters, you read of Solomon's story. And God tells him that as he's building his kingdom, that he is not to marry women that are from other groups of people in that time. And the reason for that was that the people of Israel were people who worship one God. But many of the other people groups around them, they worshipped not just one God, but they worshipped many gods. And maybe they worshipped the God of Israel, but they also worshipped, their many other gods as well. And if you've read the Bible, you go back to Exodus, God says that you will worship me and me alone, right? So we're a people of one God. But yet Solomon didn't listen to what God had told him to do. And so again, he's a very wise man, but yet also foolish at the same time, and he disobeys God. And so because of his foolishness, God takes the kingdom away. And And so I can see a little bit maybe of that story, or maybe that a little bit of that experience mirrored in what he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, that the pursuit of wisdom, or the pursuit of anything really in this world, is actually meaningless. So I think Solomon goes on, in that chapter there in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. He tells us another really interesting thing, I think. And he tells us this. He says, "What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted." I think what he's telling us here, he's telling us again that wisdom has its limitations. Wisdom only gets us so far. No matter how much we value it, and we do value it, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to value wisdom. Having wisdom is actually a very good thing. Being wise is a very good thing. You don't want to be the opposite of that. You don't want to be called foolish or be known as foolish. So embracing wisdom, especially God's wisdom, is a good thing. But we also have to realize that it only gets us so far in life. Because you look at Solomon's pursuit. I mean, he obviously did value it in his life. But he knew it still couldn't answer the deepest questions about life. It only gets us so far. Now, I would like to think that maybe we could all agree with that. That wisdom really only gets us so far in life. But yet, when I look around us, I don't think we're content with that. We're content with just seeking after all the wisdom of this world, because we continue to seek out something. We continue to seek out answers, no matter with how much knowledge we have, no matter how much schooling we have, no matter how much experience we have. This still leaves us empty. It still leaves a lot of questions unanswered. But yet, we still keep seeking. We still keep trying to gain knowledge. We still keep trying to gain wisdom to attempt to answer the deepest questions of our lives. Now I look at these simply just like a telescope. You look at Hubble and Webb. So those are the two most powerful, maybe not at this point, but at least some of the most powerful telescopes that we have in our world. And only one of the telescopes, the Hubble telescope, was created before the Webb telescope, and so Hubble is not as powerful as the Webb telescope. And so when I was reading an article about all of that, it's like we were able to look out into space with the Hubble telescope, but then we felt the need to want to create, to build another telescope that could go look even further into the universe. So that tells me that we are not content with just observing really what it is we maybe can see from here on Earth, or even just looking out a few million miles away. We need to look even further than that. Because that desire in us for a lot of the unanswered questions in our life is still there. No matter what we find out there, no matter what new planets we find, no matter what new star, new galaxy, or whatever we find, right? We're still searching. We're still seeking answers that our knowledge and wisdom cannot get us. Because we know with a lot of this stuff, I think we're really trying to answer the questions about meaning. We're trying to figure out, why is it that we're here? Right? We're in such a big universe. At this point, it doesn't seem that there are other life forms out there. But yet, we keep seeking, we keep searching, we keep looking. Why am I here? What's my purpose on this earth? Right? Those simple questions, right? But yet, we're still trying through science to find an answer for those things. But Solomon, points to this reality in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 15, that this world is a very crooked place. That this world, what it seems to be, doesn't seem like a great place to live, because there are a lot of bad things that are going on. There's a lot of evil. There's a lot of injustice going on. And for Solomon, our wisdom, again, has its limitations. Because when it comes to addressing those very questions about life, we can only observe them. Our knowledge and wisdom can only look at some injustice or some evil happening across the world and tell us that that is a bad thing that's happening. But our knowledge and wisdom can't actually do anything about it. Now, maybe it can for some other people, but for us, we know that our own wisdom and our own knowledge can't do anything about it. And so our world is a very crooked place. And we're lacking. We're lacking in various places in our own lives, in our hearts, in our minds. No matter how smart we are, no matter how much life experiences we have, or what challenges we overcome, we are still lacking. On our own, we're unable to give an answer to the deepest questions of life. We're unable to give an answer as to the why questions of life, or why things happen in our life. It kind of goes back to that whole topic of science that I just mentioned. Science attempts to answer these questions. We do this through searching and seeking into our universe and galaxy, trying to find a reason as to why things are the way they are, and we're still coming up empty. So no matter how smart we are, no matter how far we look out into the galaxy, right, we can only observe. We can only see how crooked this world is. We can only see how much we are lacking in our life. Now, Solomon tells us that human wisdom without God, can only get us so far. But embracing God's wisdom provides a way forward for us. Proverbs seems to tell us that there is a lot of usefulness to wisdom. Right? But this is not our own wisdom. This is wisdom where God is at the focus, or at the center, and He is the focus of that wisdom in our life. I think that's what Proverbs is trying to tell us. But I think when you go to Ecclesiastes, I think it tells us of the uselessness of wisdom. But that's not God's wisdom. That is our own wisdom, human wisdom. That is the best thinking that we can do on our own. Now we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 17, and here's what Solomon tells us. He says, "Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom, and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind." So he tells us of wisdom, human wisdom, the best thinking we can do on our own. But then he even says, even if you don't value that, if you don't pursue that, that the opposite of that is a bad place to be. The opposite of being wise is to be foolish, right? Or to embrace folly, to embrace madness. And so one who embraces madness and folly does life without regard to God. But wisdom can be done in the same way, right? We can still be wise and not be in a relationship with God. We can be wise and not be a follower of Jesus, right? So I'm not saying you can only be wise in a relationship with God. But what I am saying is that to embrace true wisdom, you have to be in a relationship with God. You have to be a follower of Jesus. Because we believe, and it's my conviction, that true wisdom comes from God. You read it in the book of James as well, right? Every good and perfect gift comes from above, right? God will give us wisdom if we ask. So that's what God will give to us when we come into relationship with Him. And it's only with God as the source of our lives that wisdom really has any true meaning or value for us. Because again, without God's help, wisdom, our own wisdom, only gets us so far in life. But with God, we are able to become aware of our inability to discover the truth of our own lives. You look at Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve were in a relationship with God. They walked with God, talked with God. And what we find is that when they committed the biggest sin that God told him not to do. And he says, you can eat of any fruit of any tree in this garden except for this one. And yet they ate of the tree that God forbade them to eat. And so when they did that, they forever changed our relationship with God. But yet, in that moment, they realized their separation from God. They realized their alienation from each other and from the world. And so it was only in that relationship with God that they really found out who they truly were, right? How foolish they were living, how much in madness they were living. So once we embrace God's wisdom, once we're in relationship with God, all these things start to come to the surface. And I think the same is for us as well. We realize that we are finite beings, that we are limited human beings, that we only have a limited worldview. Which means that we also realize that we can't change reality or truly change our perspective of life, especially with how troublesome it is. And you realize when it says that what is made crooked cannot be made straight. Right? Our wisdom cannot make the crooked things or the bad things of this world completely straight or make them go away. And we can't do this with human wisdom. And I'm not saying that, if we embrace God's wisdom, that we're going to be able to change reality, right, with his wisdom. But it does change our perspective that we have on life. It shifts our perspective from thinking about how we can provide the answers to life's deepest questions, how we think independently, or think that we can live independently of God. And so it changes that to us thinking or knowing that only Jesus can make the crooked things of life straight. And only he can add to our lives what we are truly lacking. And I think, again, it makes us or helps us to be content. So when we embrace God's wisdom, it helps us to be content with the fact that there are times and places in life where we're not going to have answers. Even though I speak to you guys every week, I don't have all the answers. Right? And that's a good place to be. Right? You don't want to be in a place where you think you know everything. Because I think as we travel through life, we will be rudely awakened and find out how much we don't know. Realize how much our knowledge and our wisdom is lacking. That it only gets us so far in life. So for Solomon, wisdom apart from life cannot satisfy us. Because the fact is, and the reality is that life was only ever meant to be lived with God as the source, God at the center of it all. Wisdom was never meant to be pursued as an end in itself. Even though in Ecclesiastes he tells us that, human wisdom is a meaningless pursuit because it doesn't solve the questions of life. And then in Proverbs he tells us there is usefulness to to the wisdom that we embrace. But that's not to be our sole focus. We can be wise apart from God. But to truly be wise, to become enlightened or to realize and how much sin that we're in, to realize and how much of a bad place that we are in, because maybe we do think we know everything, because we're living life on our own. We think we know better. In a relationship with God, he helps us to realize how much it is that we don't know. He helps us to realize that we are a very sinful people. And our own wisdom may not tell us that. Our own wisdom, our own knowledge may not tell us that we are separated from God, that we are in a bad place. It's only God's wisdom alone, embracing God's wisdom, that helps us to realize that and helps us to be content in life when we ourselves don't know the answer to life's deepest questions. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that you give us wisdom, your wisdom, that you don't leave us to just struggle through life, but you promise to come beside us, to guide us and to lead us. So I pray, Lord, as we conclude Proverbs, that you would help us to live wisely on this earth, that we wouldn't be foolish, that we wouldn't embrace madness, that we wouldn't embrace the things that are going to lead us down into a really bad place. Help us, Lord, to have an extra measure or get an extra measure of your wisdom, so that as we go through life, we can be aware of where it is we're lacking, that we can become aware of our lack of answers for many of life's questions. We pray that we would embrace your wisdom, because it's only your wisdom, Lord, that helps us to realize who we truly are, to realize how our world is really in a bad place, and that you alone have the answers for even all of our deepest questions, whether that's in regards to meaning or our purpose. You can provide that. And so I pray for all of us, Lord, that we would embrace that we can choose this day to follow you, that we would choose this day to embrace your wisdom and not our own, thinking that we know what's better for our lives, thinking that we know how to get through this life, when in fact we know we can't do it deeply without you. So I thank you for your word. I thank you for anyone who's listening or watching. And I pray your richest blessings upon us all. In Jesus' name, amen.